Hello friends, I am here in Woodbridge with my puppy Valentine, and I've decided to let her join us today because if I try to do today's lesson with her in her play area, she may just be whining and more distracting than she is if she's just with us. She likes to be part of everything. I hope you all had a wonderful Memorial Day weekend, had some time to relax, do some fun things. Moving forward towards the end of the year, I thought we'd do a little review on some famous composers, starting with Beethoven, and I'm going to read you the story, Why Beethoven Threw the Stew, to help jog your memory about some things you may have learned, especially if you're in fourth grade, but really in any grade. We talked about Ode to Joy this year, and let's listen to a little bit of Beethoven's music. This is Eroica, or Symphony Number 3. This will help you remember a little bit about the defining features of Beethoven's music, which was known for being very passionate. Listening to that in the background as I read you this story about his life. Turn that down just a little bit. Beethoven lived from 1770 to 1827. If you had come face to face with Beethoven in the streets of Vienna in 1820, which I admit is unlikely since you probably weren't born then, you would have thought he was very odd. His clothes were messy, his hair was messy, his hat was messy. In short, he was a mess. He would walk along very energetically, muttering and gesturing to himself, sometimes breaking into a loud laugh for no apparent reason. And then he would stop to sing, grunt or howl some notes, whip a notebook out of his pocket, write something down, and stomp off again. If you had followed him into his rooms, you'd have thought he was even odder. The place was a shambles. Sheets of music everywhere, a piano with most of its strings broken, and ink spilled inside it. Worn down furniture placed higgledy-piggledy, the remains of half-eaten food lying around, and even possibly, yuck, an unemptied chamber pot, to put it politely, sitting out in plain view. Lovely. And if, when he came in, he felt too hot after all that energetic walking, he would take a jug of cold water and pour it over his head. It would splash down onto the floor and through the ceiling of the flat beneath. Beethoven was not a good neighbor to have. Or maybe he would decide to take a bath, and he would sit in it for ages, scrubbing himself, singing and growling like a contented bear. After which, he might decide to shave, which would involve lathering soap over his whole face, right up to his eyes, because his beard spread right up there. Then he'd be bound to cut himself as he shaved because he was so clumsy. And if he noticed you suddenly and was pleased to see you, you might well find yourself covered with soap too, because he would probably run over and hug you, forgetting where he was or what he was doing, and no doubt knocking over any number of tables or chairs in the process. Then, for good measure, he'd probably crush your hand, taking it into his own hairy paw with a grip so friendly it would make your eyes water. Here is an illustration of Beethoven's messy room. However, he might not have noticed you following him down the street and into his rooms at all, because poor Beethoven was deaf. Can you imagine how awful it must have been for a great composer to lose his hearing, never to hear a note of music again? Try switching on the television, but turning off the sound, and then try to imagine how it would be to feel like that every day of your life. Dreadful, and especially for a musician. So when you finally looked into his face, you'd see that his eyes were terribly sad. But if you wrote something in his conversation book, which people found was the easiest way to talk to him, and he thought it was funny, you would see his brilliantly white teeth flash into a delighted smile, which might be followed by an enormous laugh that would stretch his whole face, including his already squishy nose, like a rubber mask. People were often scared of going to meet Beethoven because the rumor went around that he didn't like people. It's true that if he were busy writing a new piece, he would refuse to see anybody. If he did meet someone he liked, though, he would be wonderfully kind and welcoming. He could be very demanding and would often become very suspicious of even his closest friends, sometimes behaving very badly to them. But he would almost always feel terribly guilty afterwards and apologize so miserably that his real friends would forgive him everything. Once, he wrote to a friend, "Never come near me again. You are a faithless dog, and may the hangman take all faithless dogs." The very next day, he wrote the same friend, "You are an honest fellow, and I now perceive that you were right. So come to see me this afternoon." A slight change of heart. He behaved the same way to everybody. Many aristocratic patrons helped him in lots of ways. Beethoven wasn't ungrateful, but he refused to obey their every wish, just because they'd been born rich. A side note, a patron is someone who would pay composers to write music. If they wanted to have him as a friend, they had to accept him the way he was. Crumpled clothes. He would run away from a house if he was expected to dress up for meals there. Rough manners, loud laugh, and quite a temper. He refused to be treated like a performing animal. Beethoven didn't like playing in front of people for their pleasure and hated to be overheard when he was practicing or composing. He would play only if he felt like it, and when he was sure that his music was going to be appreciated. Once, he was playing at a posh gathering while a count was flirting noisily with a pretty girl in an adjoining room. Beethoven suddenly jumped up from the piano and shouted out, "I will not play for such swine." End of posh gathering. If someone he knew was in trouble, there was nobody more anxious to help than Beethoven. One of the people he tried to help was Bach's youngest daughter, Regina Susanna, who by the early 1800s was in sad straits. Beethoven raised money for her. And if you remember, Bach is one of our other famous composers that we've studied. But as he grew more deaf, although his basically kind nature didn't change, his suspicions became more exaggerated. He was sure that everybody was trying to cheat him in money matters. He imagined that people, especially his housekeepers and servants, were plotting against him. So he would sack them for no good reason. That is, if they hadn't left of their own accord after being shouted at, pelted with rotten eggs, and having heavy books thrown at their heads. Also, he kept deciding that the apartment in which he was living was unsuitable in some way or another. And so he was constantly moving house, which meant that his messy rooms became even messier. The words, "it doesn't matter," don't seem to have been part of his vocabulary at all. Everything mattered to Beethoven, from the smallest note in a piece of music to the way he made a cup of coffee. For this, the coffee, not the music, he would insist on 60 beans for each cup. Not 59, not 61, but 60. He would count them as they went in. It must have tasted horribly strong. Get a grown-up to try making a cup of coffee with 60 beans and watch their face as they sip it. Yuck. Beethoven was equally passionate about food. Once, he went to a restaurant and ordered a dish. The waiter brought him the wrong one, and when Beethoven complained, the man snapped a rude reply and disappeared into the kitchen. A moment later, he reappeared carrying lots of plates for the other diners. Beethoven, now thoroughly angry, picked up his meal, which consisted of meat with lots of gravy, and threw it into the waiter's face. The waiter was absolutely furious, but he was so busy trying not to drop the plates and licking up the gravy that was running down his chin that there was nothing he could do about it. He looked so funny that all the other diners started laughing, and suddenly Beethoven burst out laughing too and was in a good mood again. I do feel sorry for the waiter, though. Here is another illustration of that moment. Another time, Beethoven decided that he was fed up with restaurants and would cook food himself. He invited some close friends to dinner and served them with a meal he made himself. It was so revolting that none of them could eat any of it. But Beethoven loved it all, gobbling it up, and completely failed to notice that his guests were less than delighted. For some reason, Beethoven is often thought of now as a scowly, fierce man, but there were many more sides to him than that. His was a hard fate. As he himself said, "Life is so lovely, but for me, it is poisoned forever." A lesser man would have been crushed by the misfortune of losing his hearing, the sense most vital to his life's activity, but not Beethoven. He was a real hero. I think it would have been wonderful to meet him. And that concludes our story on Beethoven's life. I would love to challenge you to do a little research of your own, find some more music, either on YouTube or Spotify or wherever you like to look for music, and leave me a comment about what you discovered, what you liked, what you disliked, and maybe, if you do a little extra research, a fact that you think is interesting about his life. That's all for now. See you next time.